I want to speak with you this morning about, well, two basic points. Don't worry, and rejoice in it. The gospel reading for the day, the daily gospel reading that we just heard, addresses something that is actually pretty fundamental to, I suppose, all societies, but it seems to me to be even more characteristic of our society. Jesus starts by, this portion anyhow, he starts by talking about the eye is the lamp of the body, and if the eye is bad, you're going to not see very well. And if the darkness that is in you if you're full of darkness, how great is that darkness? And St. John Chrysostom, when he's commenting on this, ties it into what Jesus has just been saying in the previous bit of this Sermon on the Mount, which is that we're not to lay up for ourselves treasures here on earth, where moth and rust corrupt and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And he says that, St. John says, well, he's given us kind of the intellectual concept to start with. Don't worry, don't focus on laying up treasure in this world. But just in case you didn't get it, he goes down to the level of the senses and just gives this analogy about the eye, and that so that it becomes really, really, really clear, because everybody knows what it is to see and to not see. And if there's something wrong with your eye and you can't see, then everything is in darkness. And St. John's point is that this is all in reinforcement of that first point, which then Jesus goes on to continue to elaborate what should be our response to it. Which is to say, ultimately, we as human beings are pretty good at doing one thing at a time. We're not really actually that good at multitasking. There's been lots of studies that have shown that if you try and do a whole bunch of things at once, you're not going to do a very good job of any of them. But more than that, we ultimately are creatures of loyalty. And if our focus is on mammon, money, the material things that are going to provide us with happiness and security, at least that's what the advertisers tell us, that if that is our focus, he says, that ultimately becomes your God. And you actually can't live with that focus without ending up serving that, without that becoming your life, your God. And so this is a hugely stark contrast that is being presented to us here. This money stuff that we keep having to work for day in, day out, that we keep having to save up for the future to make sure that we'll have something in retirement and we'll be able to continue to live, that seems to provide security, is not to be our focus. It's not what life is about. How do we do this when this is, so much of our lives are actually focused on this? How do we serve God instead of money? And Jesus continues, and the word that he gives us, which is so wonderful and so apt about worry, it's actually Jesus telling us, how do we do this? He says, look at the lilies of the field, how they grow, how God clothes them. In fact, he says, even Solomon, in all of his splendor, the greatest king of Israel, who had enormous riches, was not clothed as beautifully as one of these. And who clothes that little flower that grows up and flourishes for a few moments and then dies and vanishes away? God does. And he goes further with this. He says, which of you, by worrying, can add a moment to your life? Can add an inch to your height? How is this worry stuff that we do, that becomes so all-consuming, that becomes our primary focus, how does this actually benefit us? And the obvious rhetorical answer is, well, it doesn't. It's a waste of time, a waste of energy. But what's the basis for not worrying? Well, he says, who gave the grass life? Who gave the grass, the flowers, this beautiful clothing? Who gives you life? And obviously, again, the rhetorical answer is God. And he goes on to say, if God has given you this great gift of life, and gives his attention to even little things like the sparrows and the grass of the field, aren't you worth more than that? Isn't your life sacred beyond and above that? How can you receive this gift of life from God and not also trust him to continue to give you all that you need? And if we are trusting God to give us all that we need, that rips the rug out from under this whole fake premise that it's all about money. Because what's money good for? For buying clothing and food and shelter and all those things that we need. But we've already just established that God is going to provide us with everything that we need. It doesn't mean that we don't do anything. It doesn't mean we don't work. It doesn't mean we don't plan. But all of that work and planning are not to get security through money. All of it is simply serving God and trusting that as we serve him, he'll give us what we need. So it seems to me that this is something that is pretty important for us living in this society which is continually feeding us the lie that you need this, you need that, you need the other thing, you need money, you need security, you need to work hard and do this and do that. No. Because if we buy that lie, we ultimately get sucked into money being our God. But if we understand that we are here because God made us, and God, having made us, will look after us and provide us with everything that we need, then we don't have to worry about money or about really anything. Now, this doesn't mean that we're not going to we might not be blessed with money. If you are blessed with money, great, good. Use it for what God has said it's good for. Buy friends. Do good to all the people around you with that money. And by doing that, you will be laying up reward for yourself in heaven, where the moth and rust do not corrupt, and thieves can't break in and steal. This is the ultimate investment. You want to put your money in someplace where it's safe? Don't go to the bank. Don't go to the stock market. Put it into people. Make sure that you are taking care of those around you. It also doesn't mean that we're not that we're sort of guaranteed that everything is going to go smoothly and it'll all be wonderful and you'll never have any tribulations. It's like, well, if just listen to the epistle reading for the day today. Paul says you're going to have tribulation, but what does he say we should do in tribulation? He says we should rejoice in it. A bit odd, but why does he say this? Well, because as we are going through tribulation, we're going to need to persevere, and that perseverance will build character, and that character will create us in the image that God wants us to be made in. It is as God is working in us and through us as we persevere in the tribulations that we are encountering, that we become the people that we were meant to be. Far more so than, the times when, it's just like, okay, everything's going great and wonderful and I don't really need to change or do anything other than enjoy the gifts and blessings that God has given me. Those are nice times too. But they don't necessarily forge that perseverance and that character that we ultimately need to become who God wants us to become. And so, when we are in that tribulation, we are to glory in it and to rejoice in it. In fact, anybody who's come to me for confession recently, which has been a few, because we're catching up after being separated for all this time, will have heard me quote Philippians chapter 4, because basically working that into every response to every confession. Not because I want to somehow put that in everything, but just that's been something that's been kind of brought home to me, where we have all of this struggle just trying to live the Christian life, and it seems so burdensome at times, and there's filled with so much conflict and anguish and angst. And yet, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And in Philippians chapter 4, Paul gives us the 10-second summary of the Christian way of life. And it's nice and simple. It says, pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks. And rejoice evermore. Not sure if I got the order right, but it doesn't really matter because they're all interconnected and they all fit together to and are part and parcel of what we have just heard Jesus teaching us to do. We're not supposed to worry. We're supposed to have our focus not on money but on God. How do we do that? Well, keep praying. Have a rule of prayer. Keep it in the morning and the evening. Make sure that rule of prayer is sustainable. It's much more important that that rule of prayer be manageable so that you can keep it as a rule than that you have this amazing prayer rule where you're standing out in the middle of the ocean and the sea otters are rubbing up against your calves and it's all really cold and you're an amazing ascetic and you've got this 4-hour rule of prayer. It's like, no, that's not what it's about. It's about bookending your day so that the day starts with prayer, even if it's just short. Light a candle, say the Our Father. That's the origin of the rule of prayer, is the Our Father. So if you can't manage anything else, say the Our Father. It takes less than 5 minutes. And the point of that is to say, it's simply to acknowledge that God is there, because that's the thing that we keep forgetting. God is there in every circumstance, in every time, in every place. He's with us. And when you come into your prayer corner and you say that prayer, it is a physical acknowledgement that God is there. And He's always been there. And He continues to be there. And then we're told to pray without ceasing. Well, the reminder that God is there should be something that sticks with us throughout the day. And then, what is prayer but communication with God? So, as you go through your day, talk to God about it. And what are we talking about with God? Well, we're giving thanks. We're giving thanks in all things, in all circumstances. Because we recognize that the good things that we receive come from the hand of God, and the bad things that we receive, the tribulations, are there to work in us perseverance and character and to make us into what God wants us to become. And given all of this, that we are giving thanks in all things and continuing to pray in all things, what should we do? We should rejoice. Ultimately, it produces in us joy, because we recognize that in all of these circumstances, I don't have to fear anything because God is with me. If God is for me, who can be against me? He's looking after me. I don't have to worry. One final word. We're celebrating kind of in anticipation the Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, which is tomorrow. We have something kind of similar in the Gospel reading for this feast that we just heard. So we actually had the daily Gospel reading, and then we had the Gospel reading for the feast, in which Jesus says to Peter basically, don't worry about the other guy. Before this, he also says, he also basically takes that absolutely dark, despairing episode, like the worst point in Peter's entire existence, and he flips it on its head. Because what was the worst point? What had to be the worst point? Here Peter had spent 3 years at least wandering around with Jesus, learning from him, becoming his disciple, being the leader of the disciples, the acknowledged leader, and he had said to Jesus, if everybody runs away, I'm going to be with you. And then what happens? When a push came to shove, Peter crumbled. He denied Jesus. He denied that he even knew the man. In the moment when Jesus most needed somebody to be standing there with him, Peter failed him. Not only failed him, but actually actively rejected him. And so what does Jesus do with Peter? He asks him if he loves him. And Peter says, well, yeah, Lord, you know I love you. And then he asks him again, do you love me? And he said, well, yes, you love me. I love you. You know that. And he asks him a third time, do you really love me? He says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. What's it about? Well, how many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. And now Jesus has given Peter 3 opportunities to affirm his love for Jesus. And then he gives him an even greater gift. Doesn't seem like one. Seems like a rather unpleasant gift. But he tells Peter how he's going to die. He says, when you were young, you girded your own clothes on you and bound the belt about you. But when you are old, they will bind you and take you away. And he said this to indicate what kind of death Peter was going to glorify God with. Gives Peter the opportunity to do what he said he was going to do. And, to suffer, and through that suffering to be made into the person that we know Peter to be today. And Peter's response is typically Peter. He's like, looks around and is like, well, Lord, what about that guy? Jesus says, don't worry about it. Don't worry about him. Focus on what I have given you to do. You follow me. And that is ultimately where I think feast of St. Peter and Paul leads us. In St. Peter and St. Paul, we have two very different, almost diametrically opposed kinds of people. One really highly educated guy who was initially persecuting the church and who converted at St. Paul, and of course the faithful Peter, who was just kind of an uneducated fisherman. And they didn't always get along. They sometimes even fought publicly, even about really important things like the theological significance of eating with the Gentiles. And yet, through following Jesus' teaching, through following Jesus, through living out the gospel, they ended up on the same side. They ended up figuring out how to be reconciled with one another. They ended up figuring out how to love one another. That's what we're called to do. That's what the way of life that Jesus gives us calls us to do. As we acknowledge that everything that we have and are, all of the circumstances of our life are brought about by God for our salvation, and simply entrust our lives, our beings to Him without worrying about all those other details, and focus in on what our responsibility is, what our job is, working out our salvation in fear and trembling. And don't worry about the other guy. We're freed up to actually appreciate the other guy, to actually love the other guy, just as Jesus loves him, accepts him. And this is the way. This is the way of life. This is the way of light. This is what illumines us and enables us to see and to, by living without worry and rejoicing in all that God gives us, to give glory through our life and our death to Him who made us and who takes care of us and who loves us. To Him be the glory. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, now and ever, to the ages of ages.